So, welcome. Today, we are going to be continuing our discussion on integrating testing into your development flow by looking at user acceptance testing. Before we get into that, though, let's quickly recap what we've covered so far in our this course on integrating testing into your development flow. We've looked at different things like how to write testable code. We've looked at the different ways to define and implement a proper test strategy and test plan into your development cycle, where these plans are really necessary at the beginning so that we can actually build software that can be tested, all of our correct documentation throughout the process. We've looked at using unit testing to test our individual units of software, not just from a developer perspective, but also from a tester's perspective as well. We looked at using frameworks like SNG and JUnit to build these unit tests using Selenium for web-based testing and just plain old Java unit tests for testing the backend. We also looked at different types of software patterns like black box, white box testing, and we've also looked at the different levels of testing like systems testing, integration testing. And today we'll be looking at acceptance testing. So briefly, today we are going to be covering who, what, when, where, and hows of user acceptance testing. We're going to look at what is user acceptance testing, why do we want to do user acceptance testing, when is it typically performed, who does this type of testing, and how to do the actual user acceptance test. Basically, what are the steps and processes that we need to actually do to implement the types of testing. And finally, we'll look at best practices in the Q&A. Let us begin. So what is user acceptance testing? Well, it is a type of testing performed by the end user or the client to verify and accept the software system before moving the software application to the production environment. It is also known as beta or end user testing. Also can be defined as testing the software by the user or client to determine whether it can be accepted or not. In our process of testing, acceptance testing falls at the end of the testing cycle. So this will be after we've done our unit testing, integration testing, system testing, and essentially at this point, we have everything we need for the software. So the software is fully deployed, meaning that everything has been committed, all the code builds are done, system testing, we know everything should work, and we have our environment for the users to finally go out and actually test not just the functionality of the application, actually make sure that the applications work to the specifications of the business to the end user. Why do we want to do user acceptance testing? Well, this cartoon has been around for a long time and it's constantly being evolved and modified. But the main purpose of the testing is to validate the software against the business requirements. We don't want the tire swing tree model to unfortunately be the outcome of our software development. We actually want our software to meet the customer's requirements. We actually want the software to do what the user wants it to do. So, unfortunately, this comic here really depicts what happens in most software environments, through most software development cycles. Uh, it starts out where the customer explains what they want, but the person actually writing down the requirements doesn't necessarily get all the business requirements or the user requirements they need. They get the gist, but they don't quite have it right. And then, of course, throughout this development cycle, things kind of fall apart as it goes through. Especially like the lower left picture there. Typically, most projects are not well documented, or there's no documentation at all. So, as you can see there, there's no tree. Uh, and when you also get to support, typically it's not supported well, or If we have well documented applications and really good training and specifications, it can be well supported. But typically, what we start with from the customer explanation, we really don't necessarily always end up with what the customer wants. Hence, why we need user acceptance testing. Uh, sorry about that. Another way to look at why we need user acceptance testing is essentially within. So once our software has undergone all the different testing phases, the our integration, our system testing, we still need to do this last step, the user acceptance testing, just to make sure that everything meets the requirements of the end user. And why we have to do this is because developers and the testers kind of have a functional mindset. They see the requirements, they look at the requirements as kind of a black and white roadmap for what they need to do. So they go ahead, they take these requirements, they write the code, they test the code to its functionality to make sure that, say, a button is clicked or that there is a contact information page. But what they are missing, or what could be missed, are the business requirements that only the end user would know or the end user would anticipate. So even though the developers and the testers have tested and coded the application uh, correctly or correctly to the specifications that were laid out in front of them, their specifications could be missing key points that the business needs. Um, so these are just another way of testing to make sure that before the application is finally put out, that everything is there and that it meets the business requirement. When it's performed, typically it's performed as the last step before the production go live. Before the delivery of the project is accepted, it's also performed after the product has been thoroughly tested, typically after system testing. Now, some documentations and some sites will tell you that user acceptance testing should also be done after regression testing. I agree and disagree with that on two different levels. One, if this is a brand new application and this is the first time it's going out the door, then yes, it really needs to be done after regression testing. Because at this level of testing, at the user acceptance testing, the only thing that really should still be here at a bug level, or it could be here at a bug level that's acceptable, are essentially screen defects or GUI defects where a color might not be right, a button might be slightly misaligned. Those can still be in the application at the time of user acceptance. Because what we're actually testing here is not just the functionality and the working of the application, but we're looking to make sure that the application meets all the business requirements, that it meets all the end users' criteria, so that the end user can actually use the application the way they expected to be able to use it. Now, on the flip side of that, though, once an application has been out for a couple months, couple iterations, at that point, a lot of the changes going in, unless they are drastic, are really just small tweaks to the applications, either small customizations, new features being added. But if they are small and they're not major rewrites of a particular page, for instance, then really the user acceptance testing should be done after the regression. That way, the system's been regressed. We know that there's no more bugs. Everything is fully working and is ready for essentially a production deploy. We just now have to take one additional step and do the user acceptance testing, run through the application, just make sure that everything is still working as the business requires it. Who does user acceptance testing? Well, the validation is essentially carried out by the end user who are familiar with business requirements. This typically can be clients or other end users. This could be either someone who is buying a product in case of commercial software. This could also be someone who has had software custom built through a software service, or end user if the software is made available to them ahead of time and when their feedback is sought out. For example, if we are beta testing a new video game. This could be a test team. The team could be comprised of beta testers, or the customer should select members of their uh, team or members in their company that from different groups of the organization, so they could actually test their particular role in the application. This is definitely common for testing things like HR software, payroll software, or things like Jira, where you have multiple teams, multiple departments using the application to enter tickets and debug tickets. Next, we have the tasks to be performed by the testers. So these are essentially the four things or the four tasks that really need to be performed by the user, by the UA testers. They need to confirm that the system or product performs the business functionality as is intended per the business requirements. They need to confirm that the system or product is usable from an end user perspective. They also need to confirm that the system or product is compliant with regulatory and or legal requirements. And finally, they need to certify that the system or product is deemed ready to be moved into production. Now, these seem to be common sense, but really, these are the main criteria for UA testers. We just need to make sure that it performs business functionality, that the business requirements uh, are essentially met. But the problem you run into is that a lot of times the business requirements are missed. Uh, if we go back and take a look at our trade example here, right at the beginning, we start out with how the customer explained it. Well, it's explained, they may have explained it correctly, but the person interpreting it as they wrote down the requirements misinterpreted what the person was saying. So we definitely need to make sure that we confirm that the system or product performs business functionality as intended per the business requirements. But we also need to make sure that those business requirements are valid. So throughout the process of our development cycle, we really need to focus on these business requirements as we write our code and as we uh, write the tickets for what the code needs for the application. Here's a list of the different steps in the UAT process. So we start out with the analysis of business requirements. We create the UAT test plan. We identify the test scenarios. We create the UAT test cases. We also can create production data. So we can do the preparation of test data, run the test cases, record the results, and confirm the business objectives. Pretty much the same thing we have done at each of the levels of testing. However, in this particular case, it is now all from the user's perspective. So we are now looking at the applications from the user. Unfortunately, before we can get to this process, there's a couple prerequisites that need to be met first. So first, we need to have the business requirements. So we need to make sure that those were defined correctly at the beginning of our development lifecycle. We need to make sure that the application code is complete and fully developed and deployed. We also need to make sure that the unit testing, the integration testing, and system testing has been completed. We also need to make sure that there are no showstoppers, no high, medium defects in the system integration test phase. Uh, Before going to UAT, all bugs should be addressed. We can let cosmetic errors um, be deployed to the UAT or be visible in the UAT. We're again testing it on the user acceptance test. We want to make sure that the application works. If we have some cosmetic issues, those can always be fixed with minimal impact to functionality. Again, regression testing should be completed with no major defects. Typically, if you are in a beyond the initial release of the software, all the reported defects can be fixed and tested before UAT. The traceability matrix for all testing should be completed. UAT environment must be ready. And then finally, sign off either mail or report communications from the system test team that the system is ready for the UAT execution. Now, in some environments, you will have a UAT environment. This could be a demo environment. It could be just a UAT environment. Unfortunately, though, a lot of companies don't have money or don't feel it necessary to actually set up a third tier environment. In fact, some don't even set up a QA environment. So typically, UA testing could be done on a development environment, or hopefully at least at best a QA environment. In some cases, especially if it's first run of the application, it's the first batch. Typically, UAT will be done in the production environment, but not in a live environment. So yes, production is staged, it's ready to go, the user tests it, but it's not actually released to the general populace. So we're still doing that beta testing. So next, we're going to go over some of the key activities of each of these phases. First, we have the initial phase. And in this phase of UAT, we start out by actually defining the approach we're going to take for our testing. We are going to have the business users who will be performing this testing, and we will identify them. Again, this could be the corporations going out and picking people from different parts of the company to test the different roles. The testing environments are sorted out. Will they be testing in QA? Will they be testing in UAT? Is this a piece of software that actually gets deployed to a machine, in which case it needs to be installed on a test machine? Do we need test data? If so, we need to get the requirements for it, and then we need to actually define it. And finally, if required support from all other teams are discussed and support teams are identified. So as we're actually going through the UAT, these will be the people that will be available to the tester in case they run into problems, identify defects, or essentially are there to be their front line of support. Next, we have the design phase. Here, this is where business scenarios to be validated and identified and documented. So this is where we actually go through the requirements and actually build out the test scenarios for the user acceptance testing. We're again going to take the relevant test data and define it. The scenarios are uploaded into the corresponding management tools, and the appropriate user accesses are requested and sorted out. In the execution phase, here the test execution of the business scenarios are performed. The appropriate defects are raised in the test management tools, and the defect retesting and regression testing is performed. If no defects are found, then the last step is skipped. The software essentially is written off and then or signed off on, and then the application pulls out the door. But until that happens, any defects that do get determined are raised, and then it gets pushed back to development to be tested. Finally, the closure phase, the UAT closure report is produced. This basically identifies any additional defects, any problems that were found, problems that were fixed. Also covers the go, no-go decision and recommendations if the software is ready to go out the door or not. Now, I know we briefly talked about who is responsible for testing, but let's actually take a step back. So, since this is a discussion on implementing testing into your development life cycle, let's actually look at the different roles and responsibilities that will play out throughout the process of UAT. So here we have the three different roles. You're going to have the business programmer manager, or this could also be a business analyst if they're the one in charge of gathering the requirements and actually implementing uh, the test or the implementing the changes to the development teams, to the IT managers. We also have a UAT manager, and then we have the UAT teams and the leads of the teams. So the business programmer, uh, their role is to create and maintain the delivery plan. They need to review and approve the UAT test strategy and plan before they get to the user acceptance testing. They need to ensure the successful completion of the programmer or schedule and budget. They need to liaise with the IT programmer manager and monitor the progress of the uh, application. They need to work closely with the business operations team and they equip them from day one of the operation and essentially have be a part of this process from beginning to end. They need to also sign off on the business requirements document. They need to review any e-learning course or content, or frequently asked questions pages or documentation that gets rolled out. And finally, they are responsible for delivering the progress report and the weekly status report of the application of the development cycle. Are you a test manager? They are responsible for creating the actual UAT strategy. Now, this needs to really be done at the start of the project. Essentially, when we're actually talking about building things like the test scenarios and the test plans. So they need to participate in the requirements walkthrough meetings. They need to review the effort estimations. They need to review the test plans or test strategy and make sure that they understand all the requirements that are necessary for the application and what is necessary for testing. They need to review the requirement traceability reports and make sure everything is defined there is met. And they also need to drive the metrics collection to qualify the benefits derived from the updating testing methodologies, tools, and environments that will be used. And finally, they're going to be responsible for delivering the master test strategy. They're going to be responsible for review and approve test scenarios, review and approve test cases, review and approve requirement traceability matrix, and also they need to be a part of weekly status review and status reports. Lastly, we have our UAT test lead and team. Here, their responsibilities are to verify and validate the business requirements against the business process. They need to define the time estimation for how long it will take to do the actual testing. They need to create and execute the UAT test plan. They need to participate in requirements gathering sessions. They need to prepare test scenarios, test cases, and test data based on the business process. Let's see, they need to also execute test cases and prepare test logs, or in cases, if you have things like Jira, make sure that they execute the test cases and update the Jira tickets. They need to report defects in the test management tool like Jira and manage them throughout their lifecycle. They also need to produce a end of test report. So once testing is done, they need to build the report. They also need to provide the business readiness support and live, uh, sorry, the business readiness support and live support testing, and they're also responsible for delivering the final test log, weekly status reports, defect reporting, test execution matrix, test summary reports, and the archived reusability test artifacts. Now, in each of these, I mentioned weekly status reports, also talked about weekly meetings. This unfortunately doesn't always apply in every single software environment. In some of your software development life cycles, especially in Agile, you may have sprints that are 2 week, 1 week, or in some cases, monthly. Whereas in those cases, you have the shorter sprints, your weekly status reports potentially could become daily status reports. So, really, the reporting and meeting times will kind of vary based on the different types of environments that you're in. Especially if you're in a fast-paced agile environment, you probably be doing this more daily than weekly. Next, we have some different tools we can use with our user acceptance testing. We can use things like Selenium to actually record and playback uh, our user functional testing. If we can actually define it correctly and we have all the roles defined, we can record these tests and then apply them to our regression and automation testing in the future. We can use things like the fitness tool. This is a Java tool used as a testing engine. It is easily used to create test record results in the table. Users of the tool can enter the formatted input and tests are created automatically, and the tests are then executed and the output is returned back to the user. And in the other one, Waiter, this is an interesting little toolkit that is used to automate browser-based testing during user acceptance testing. So again, these are all kind of record playback tools. But I like Selenium a little bit more than these other tools because one, it's open source, and two, you have full customization over everything that you do. Whereas the other two tools do have a small cost to them, but it may be worth checking them out and seeing if it's something that you need. Next, we have best practices. So here is a list of 9 steps that essentially we need to do to make sure that UAT is successful. We want to make sure that we prepare the UAT plan early in the project lifecycle. We want to prepare the checklist before the UAT starts, conduct the pre-UAT sessions during the system testing phase. We want to set the expectation and define the scope of the UAT clearly. We also want to test end-to-end business flow and avoid system tests. We want to test the system or application with real-world scenarios and data. We want to think as an unknown user to the system. We want to perform the usability testing. And then finally, we want to conduct feedback sessions and meetings before moving to production. So I saved this slide for last because here is where we really can look at taking the best practices of the user acceptance testing. And really, we can look at not only applying these at the end where we need to do user acceptance testing, but we can actually look at these throughout the whole software development lifecycle. We can actually look at using these and implementing these at the different phases. So, for instance, at the beginning of the software lifecycle, where we're actually gathering the requirements and we're setting all of our documentation, like our test plans or test scenarios. Um, that is a good point to get everyone involved, as we've said before. But as a developer, not only should the testers be involved in these requirement gathering, you really should kind of have a developer in there as well, because the developers can hear all the different things that are being questioned and the things that are being implemented and put together. They can also hear and review these checklists as they actually go and actually start to write their code, as they start looking at the different functionalities that they need to put together. Uh, Also, as we move into the design phase, when we look at, say, designing a web page and what needs to be on that page, not only can the UAT and the testers be involved there, they can also give insight to the developer as to how the end user will be using the application, will be using functionality that they will actually be coding. That is very useful because, again, from a developer's perspective, I see a requirement, I see what I need to code, and I am literally just going to write that functionality. I really don't care, or in the mindset, it's not that they don't care, but they are so hyper focused on just that piece of the puzzle that they are not looking at the big picture. So, yes, they may have a toggle button that changes something on the screen, but they may not fully understand that the toggle button is actually meant to do more than just change a few things on the screen. Also, as we move through the development cycle, they can also get with the testers and business to actually coincide with how that particular software is going to work, or change that they do to the system. Something else that is useful at this stage is not only is test data useful for testing at the end of the test development cycle, but it's also useful for the coders and developers as they're writing the code to actually have the real world data, so to speak, so that they aren't just testing random things to make sure that the inputs work as expected. They may be testing just for functionality to make sure that, oh, this button works, this input field works, the data is being stored into the database, but they're not actually testing real world scenarios. So you could run into a situation, whereas if you're using a user input screen, where you may have inadvertently set your fields to be too short. So your data input may be 52 characters, but your data input field cuts off at 50 characters. So those are things that not only is UAT having them involved early on helps kind of guide this information, but this is stuff that really should be caught with the requirements gathering phase. But it could be missed simply because we are not thinking as an unknown user, or we're not using real world scenarios or data. Also, usability testing. So, again, if you're the developer and you're just testing out one piece of code, you're writing one piece of functionality, you're not really, again, concerned with the overall application. And really, as from a developer's perspective, I wrote my code, I've tested it, it works, move on. Really, developers need to take a step back, and in their mind, as they're writing the code, they really need to do essentially a quick smoke test of the application once they've committed their piece of code. Now, this is hard to do early on in a project because at the start of a brand new application, most of the application may not be there. You have a whole bunch of different puzzle pieces of code that need to be written and then put together for the application to actually work as an application. So early development, sure, not there, but for older, more defined legacy type application, any code change you make really should be followed with a smoke test from the developer to make sure that their change did not break something else somewhere else in the system. And finally, again, having these feedback sessions, having these meetings. I'm not a huge fan of meetings myself because typically meetings can go off the rails. But if you follow the test plan, if you follow the test strategy, and you use that as your blueprint, as your meeting outline, you should be able to have well constructed daily or weekly meetings to make sure that the application is flowing, coming together the way it's meant to be, that we are meeting all the requirements at each stage of the development cycle. And so that by the time we get to the user acceptance testing, we have put together an application or we have made a change to the application that actually meets the business requirements, meets the end user needs. And with that, does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, how do you deal with the UAT team? Because usually they change their mind and you think like, okay, you've done with a project and you feel like you've covered all the requirements. Then they are like, oh no, maybe we need this here now. Then you gotta go back on the drawing board.
So that's a good question. So what you're essentially asking, or what you're describing there, is something that, from a developer's perspective, we like to call scope creep. But in a lot of cases, though, that can happen. Throughout the life of an application, throughout the development of an application, if you don't do checkpoints throughout the application, things like that will happen. You'll get to the end of the application and they'll realize that, oh, we're missing this, or oh, we're missing that. These are things that happen because UAT was not included, or the users were not included in the development process. They were not involved enough at the requirements gathering phase. They were not involved during the design phase, or even the development phase. And unfortunately, in that situation, if you run across that a lot, the company or the project manager really needs to take a step back and say, wait, yes, an application is a living thing. And it could potentially change as the users start to see that the application come together. What sometimes happens is, one case, you have a user that in their mind, they know what they want, but they really conceptually can't see it. They can describe what they want, but they really don't know what it looks like or how it's really going to come together. So once you actually start writing the software, and they start to see what it can and it can't do, then they end user typically will come back, and in those cases they'll be like, oh, so we can do this. Well, can we also do that? So now you start adding additional features. And that's typically what we call that scope creep, because it's like, well, it's not what you asked us to do initially. That wasn't in your initial quote. So we need to either go back and address that with additional pricing, etc. But what you typically run into, someone needs to go on mute. Okay, so what you typically run into in situations like that is, so if you run into that a lot, you need to start getting the users more involved at the different stages. Either if you're a larger corporation and you are actually developing software, say, for a corporation, or, for example, when I worked at Northrop Grumman, we were working on software for the state of Tennessee, and the state of Tennessee actually had 3 dedicated user testers for those particular roles for the software that we were writing. So they were actually embedded on the test team and were testing and working with the developers at every stage of the process. So that's one way to address the problem. But typically the best way to address this is to just make sure that the user is constantly being updated as to the progress of the application. And when there are questions, go back to the customer, go back to the user. Make sure that the requirements that are listed meet their, get more information on it. Make sure that it's well defined, it's explained in such a way that the developer can actually write the software correctly. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yes, it does. Probably another question I can ask you. I know usually the UAT team is sometimes it's one of the hardest teams to deal with. It's like, what percentage do you, I mean, you have deadlines, but at what percentage would you release the software for the UAT to look at? Like in case you're in the, let me say, waterfalls software development lifecycle.
Well, unfortunately, the waterfall UAT would essentially be at the end. But again, if you really want to apply good testing practices, UAT should be involved from the very beginning, just like the test team should be involved from the very beginning. So really, at each stage, so at the gathering requirements, you should have a user in there as well. At the design phase, the user's input should be included within those meetings. And then even throughout development, I would say have the users, end users, still even hit like a development environment or a QA environment. The problem you have, though, so many companies skimp on QA because they think that, I mean, to be fair, developers are costly, but to actually design, implement, and code and then deploy the software, they feel that really all the work is done before QA. And QA really to them is, does the application work? Are there any bugs, like foreseeable bugs? And typically the software is just released and the end user doesn't really get a test until they actually receive the software. In most cases, that's not ideal. But a lot of companies, unfortunately, don't have the additional funds to include enough QA to test for that. But that's why I put this course together, because really the best way to address this is to start embedding and start using more QA throughout the full development cycle. So in those cases, I would recommend, again, including more QA early on and even in your daily meetings.
Okay, all right, guys.
But that's, now that is definitely, that's a waterfall issue. From the agile approach, it should be a UAT of some sort really at each sprint. If you have a sprint that delivers, that has some sort of deliverable, that has a release, then there should be a UAT essentially representative or process there. Your actual sprint review should be effectively a UAT as well, because you should have people that are representing that end customer. They're looking at what you've done and saying, "Yep, this is on track. This is acceptable for where we should be," and it should be integrated from sprint to sprint. There should be somebody in there every step of the way.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? All right. So to quickly review, today we covered the different parts of user acceptance testing. We covered what is user acceptance testing, being the part of the testing where we're actually getting the end user to test the application for functionality and business requirements. We also looked at why do we want to do user acceptance testing. We looked at when it is performed after systems testing and integration testing. And we looked at the different types of roles that do this types of testing, like the business programming manager, the UAT managers, and the UAT team leads and teams. And then we looked at how to actually do the user acceptance testing. What are the different phases of the testing? And finally, we looked at the best practices and looked at how we can apply those best practices to our development cycle so that we can actually start including more UAT into our development process. With that, that wraps up our discussion for this presentation. I'd like to thank you. We appreciate your time. And if you would like to discuss any of these topics further, you can reach us at info@developerner.com. You can find us on http://developerner.com/contact us. We're also on Twitter at developer. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/developer. And we are now also on YouTube. So please check us out, follow us on our website, and watch all our old videos. Our goal is making every developer better. Thanks again. Have a great day.